No rush, y'all, but we're ready whenever.
Okay, sounds good.
Sorry, my computer is very buggy right now. Is it all right if I just like quickly leave the room, restart, and then I'll be back in like a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. All right, thanks for waiting.
All right. Everybody good? Okay. We negate. Contention 1 is hegemony. U.S. dollar hegemony is strong and will sustain. Costigan 17 finds the dollar has become the global monetary instrument that only the U.S. can produce by fiat. The U.S. produces dollars that are required to purchase goods. Despite the difficulties the dollar confronts, the role of the dollar in international finance through its reserve function will endure for the foreseeable future. Even competitors are dollar-denominated. Costigan continues that both the AIIB as well as the BRICS Development Bank are dollar-denominated entities and sustain and extend dollar-denominated lending. IMF caused dollar hedge in two ways. The first is the gold standard. Lagna 12 finds the IMF was conceived under the U.S. hegemony. The U.S. dollar was pegged to gold and all other national currencies were pegged to the dollar. The IMF was an essential constituent in the U.S.-centered monetary order by providing mutual assistance to member countries. Second is the mediary. Lagna 12 finds that the fund adhered to the discourse of global market efficiency and simply accepted U.S.-led financialization at face value. It became an intermediary between the economic policies of the Washington Consensus and the developing world. The IMF supported American hegemonic order by correcting its deficiencies. Dollar hegemony is the linchpin to U.S. hegemony militarily. Costigan concludes that the dollar's reserve status is crucial for the maintenance of military bases and aspects of U.S. hegemonic power. The dollar and its reserve status is the most fundamental reason the U.S. is a hegemon. The first impact, the impact is miscalculation with Russia. Risk of miscalculation is increasing in the Arctic as Sokolsky et al. 21 finds mutual accusations and warnings by NATO and Russia about the threat they pose to each other, risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, unintended escalation is likely, and the risk is likely to increase as opposing forces continue to operate in close proximity to each other. Neither side has shown a willingness to back down. Hegemony causes war with Russia. Zuckerman 16. The danger of nuclear war through miscalculation with Russia is quite credible. Russia feels threatened regarding U.S. military hegemony, and it could lead to a military conflict and the escalation to the use of nuclear weapons. Because of that, U.S. hegemony is a recipe for extinction. Star 14 indicates the neocons running U.S. foreign policy believe the U.S. has nuclear primacy over Russia. By concluding that Russia would be unable to retaliate, it invites nuclear war. A successful nuclear first strike would cause the citizens of the side that won the nuclear war to perish from the nuclear famine, just as would the rest of humanity. Neocon ideology has kept the U.S. in war during the entire 21st century. It has revived the Cold War, and American exceptionalism based on hard power is the hubris and arrogance that could lead to the termination of all human life. Contention 2 is resource extraction. Natural resource dependency in LICs is increasing. Row 16 finds that of the 72 low-income countries we identify as the most dependent, 88% became more dependent. The IMF is a tool of the global north and extract resources for rich countries in two ways, and the first is debt repayments. Downey 10 finds that structural adjustment programs imposed on developing nations by the IMF force developing nations to maintain high levels of raw material exports so as to meet their debt obligations. That's distinctly different from private debt obligations, as Batico 2 indicates that because debts owed to the IMF cannot be rescheduled like debts owed to private sources, structural adjustment compels people to over-exploit natural resources with no consideration for sustainability. Second is foreign ownership. Hilson finds that SAPs are simply a means of facilitating widespread foreign ownership with the primary industry sectors of the developing world and increasing the production and exportation of raw materials. That's why Hilson indicates that increased levels of foreign investment translated into a doubling of production. The first impact is war. Downey 10 finds that protesters may be worried about the local degradation and from resource extraction, and they may be aggrieved by a loss of livelihood, but then the governments who control natural resources feel they have no choice but to use violence to protect their resources. Those conflicts have an impact on countless number of people, and stunt development, as Bannon indicates, more than 1 billion people live in countries facing a high risk of civil war, which sets them on the path to reverse development, and 50 armed conflicts had a strong link to natural resource exploitation. The second is the resource curse. African countries were diversifying before, as Sokolsky 20 finds that the state-sponsored industries work to diversify revenue sources, but Rowden 11 indicates that exporting a few raw materials traps countries into low level of development. That's why Roser 19 concludes that over the coming decade, more than 500 million risk being stuck in extreme poverty.
Massey, do you need anything?
I just wanted to see the last card you read.
Oh yeah, that was gonna be one of mine. And then in addition to that, do y'all mind if I get the first card under your impact scenario about Russia saying war is likely?
Yep.
And the evidence that says on your second contention that Africa was diversifying absent the IMF.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's going to be, just grab me the last one. It's just going to be the order in which you called for them.
Sounds good. And whenever we get that, Rebecca can just start constructing while we're doing that.
Okay. Just those three?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're sent.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Did you get it? Oh, that's the original email. Never
Yeah,
mind.
it's the original. Okay, just got it.
Awesome. Okay. We affirm contention 1 is curbing China. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, is a program of Chinese-funded infrastructure projects. India perceives it as a serious threat. Chuduri 20 of the Economic Times confirms that a powerful counterbalance to the rising India, CPEC is a strategic tool to encircle India. However, the IMF has countered the influence of China by shutting down CPEC. In order to renegotiate Pakistan's IMF program, the Times of India 21 reports that the IMF will resume the program only if Pakistan does not take out any new commercial loans. Consequently, SACS 21 of the Council on Foreign Relations confirms that post-IMF bailout, Pakistan is now looking to delay debt repayments to China for a decade, concluding that CPEC is unlikely to ever fulfill the grand vision laid out in 2015. The impact is preventing war. CPEC is highly threatening to India as it represents China's partnership with India's most dangerous enemy. If CPEC is completed, Marquis 17 of War on the Rocks writes that India will explore conventional military initiatives in response to what it interprets as an expanding strategic threat. Pakistan is poised to respond to any Indian conventional maneuver with its large nuclear arsenal. Wilson 19 of the National Interest writes that Pakistan's growing inventory of tactical nuclear weapons are part of an effort to counter an Indian conventional incursion. Consequently, he concludes that war could lead to the death of some 2 billion. Contention 2 is recession recovery. The IMF allocates special drawing rights, or SDRs, which are unconditional injections of capital to countries in crisis. In fact, Cox 21 of CNBC reports that the Treasury is working with the IMF to provide $650 billion in currency aid to countries hit hardest by the pandemic. This has worked before. During the 2008 crisis, NI 20 of Yale University reports that the SDR allocation increased reserves by about 19% for low-income countries and helped to close fiscal gaps, meet external obligations, or counteract foreign exchange shortages. Similarly to 2008, SDRs can provide the economic stimulus that the world needs. Lipsky 21 of the Wall Street Journal explains that SDRs would provide liquidity to many low-income countries that today have severely limited access to external financing, but have the pressing need to pay for health and economic support. Consequently, Sonnet 20 of the University of Notre Dame finds that issuing SDRs is currently one of the most useful options to help contain the pandemic and keep the global economy from collapsing. The impact is preventing a crisis. The World Bank 20 projects that the current recession will push an additional 115 million people into extreme poverty this year, with the total rising to as many as 150 million by the end of 2021. Contention 3 is the global financial safety net. According to Stiglitz 20 of Columbia University, a global debt crisis is looming. More than 100 low and middle income countries will still have to pay a combined $130 billion in debt this year. With much economic activity suspended and fiscal revenues in free fall, many countries will be forced to default. If indebted countries defaulted, they would bring down Western financial institutions with them. This is because, as Vogel 20 of the American Interest confirms, there's a formidable amount of debt owed by governments to private international investors. This would end in disaster. According to McDowell 17 of Syracuse University, as banks face the possibility of foreign losses on multiple fronts, concerns about the capital adequacy of banks generate fears that banks might fail, threatening the stability of the entire domestic financial system. However, the IMF prevents the collapse of the global financial system. The IMF's loans ensure that, in the event of that a country does default, the brunt of the losses are taken by the IMF and not by Western financial institutions. For example, Krugman 12 of Princeton University writes that in the 1980s, the third world debt crisis threatened to bring down the entire international financial system, so the IMF stepped in to provide loans to countries that could not pay back their foreign creditors. Consequently, the IMF ensures that these crises do not spill over to the rest of the financial system. Absent the IMF, a financial crisis of this magnitude would be catastrophic. In the last great financial crisis, Boston University concludes that 100 million people fell into poverty. Thus, we are proud to affirm. Do y'all need any evidence, or are you ready for cross?
Yeah, can I see your SACS 21 evidence from CPEC? And then the 150 million impact on C2, and also the uniqueness evidence on C3.
Got you. I got it. You said the impact evidence from C2? 150 million? Okay. And then what was the last thing you wanted? Sorry. The
uniqueness on C3. Just everything, like the Stiglitz and the two cards after it.
Got it. Just sent it all.
Okay, when we get it, I'll let you know, and then you all are good to start cross.
Excellent.
I just got it.
Okay, I haven't gotten it yet, but I'll tell you when I do.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, I've got it. Thanks.
Can I have the first?
Sorry?
Can I have the first question?
Yeah, of course.
So why does CPEC need to be fully completed for India to lash out?
because that's when it's going to fully encircle India and when India would see that it's like threatening enough for them to start a large scale conflict.
Well, geographically, it's never going to fully encircle India. So it's more about the perception of it.
Well,
what if it was like 80% done?
No,
Would
the
that be
goal
enough?
is moving into like super strategic places, like for example, into Kashmir region, which is super disputed between India and Pakistan. And if it were to enter into those regions, that is when India would see the bright line and be forced to attack.
Okay, you can have a question.
Okay. On your contention one about miscalc, so how long has there been dollar hegemony?
Since Bretton Woods, so I guess that's about 70 years.
Okay, why have we never seen and or what is the bright line as to when we are going to see this miscalc and nuclear war occur?
Imminently, our Sikorski evidence is really good in saying that risk is really high right now and we're barreling towards it. And the STAR evidence says that extinction is functionally inevitable in the near future because of dollar hedge. Can I have a question?
There, I'm not entirely sure when your Skaliski evidence is from because I didn't write down the
It's
date.
20. It's from 2 weeks ago, I think.
Okay, but the STAR evidence is from 2014. So if we've been projecting this since 2014, like I'm just
Well, it's this.
is there if you've been saying imminently since 2014?
Well, STAR was not imminently. It was that the way that we have constructed our hegemony and the fact that we are hegemon guarantees extinction. And the uniqueness is from 2 weeks ago and saying that we're barreling towards that scenario now. Can I have a
Why
question?
is it right now? Like if the link
Because Russia's expanding in the Arctic right now. Can I have a question, please, though?
Sure.
Okay, so you say that they would have to expand into Kashmir, right? What CPEC plan is going into Kashmir?
That's an example of one plan into CPEC that was planning to go into Kashmir. Obviously not anymore because our evidence explains that CPEC has now been halted because of the IMF.
Wait, so what was going to go through Kashmir?
Like infrastructure projects.
Well, what card says that?
I mean, that's just what CPEC was going to do. That's the Chidori evidence.
Well, no, I understand what CPEC was going to do. I'm saying what card says it was going through Kashmir?
The Chidori evidence.
It says CPEC was going through Kashmir?
It says it's going into strategic regions in order to encircle India.
Okay, strategic regions is not the same as Kashmir.
Like I'm pretty sure the Chidori evidence. If not, you can call for other evidence that we have that says that it was going to go into Kashmir. I'm happy to send it to you after.
That's fine.
But that was the plan.
Yeah, you can have a question.
Yeah. Okay. So what has increased if dollar hegemony is what is going to lead to your link for this nuclear war? What is the timeline? Why is Russia expanding now? Why is Russia going to expand anyway? Or are they only expanding to combat dollar hegemony or US hegemony?
Russia probably wouldn't have been as expansionary without the US as a hegemon in the first place, because most of their actions are defensive and most of what they do is to posture against the US. To answer your first question as to like why it's happening now, Russia's expanding uniquely in the Arctic right now. So like that's the uniqueness scenario. And then the conflict scenario comes out of that specific uniqueness.
Okay. I think that's time.
Yeah. Can we see Kashmir?
It's in my file. Let me
I have it. It's dropped right there.
Here, yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. Okay, sent.
Just that.
Once we get it, Skylar will call me and we'll start prep.
Sounds good. Just let us know when you'll have it.
That's good. Starting. All right, that was 39 seconds. If everyone's ready, I'll start. Okay, so the order is going to be just straight down the case. And okay. Start on CPEC. First off, it's non-unique. CPEC is continuing the status quo. Rafiq 20 explains that when Pakistan entered the IMF program, plenty of observers assumed that CPEC would be one of the casualties, but Pakistan is actually doubling down on CPEC as a major vehicle of economic growth and has a new steward, which is the Pakistani army. Prefer this to their evidence. Their own CFR uniqueness concludes that CPEC is going to continue just in smaller and more frequent projects, which still encircles India. Second, it's non-unique. If it were to collapse, it would be because of alternative reasons. Serene 18 explains that other smaller projects have refused funding by the Chinese. Chinese private companies and even bankers are asking serious questions about the viability of their investments in Pakistan. That was why it would collapse should it collapse. But third, you could turn it because of energy. Alika Malik 18 explains that proposed oil and gas pipelines would be helpful to the energy crisis, and the proposed corridor could virtually rephase the economic revival of Pakistan. That's key to decreasing poverty, as Zhang 18 quantifies that more than 250 million people in the region still live without access to electricity. Fourth, turn it because of economic benefits. Aliyan Malik 18 explains that much of the terrorism in this particular region is due to lack of economic development. If we can develop the CPEC initiative in those areas, that would have dealt a major blow to extremist terror in Pakistan. That's the most probable cause of conflicts, as our evidence is the probability comparison. Markey 15 explains an Indo-Pak crisis is most likely to take place as a consequence of a major terrorist attack in India perpetrated by a group based in Pakistan. Modi is likely to respond with force more than his predecessors. But six, on the impact level, there's no link because CPEC doesn't actually encircle India. Randat 18 explains that some argue that the venture may fuel India's fears of encirclement, but India's claims are arguably more important in the maritime trade routes in the Indian Ocean and hold far more weight in their calculations. Seven, there's no link because there's no Indo-Pak war. History proves and restraint is much more likely in the current political climate. Cribbin 19 explains that both sides have acted with restraint, and Pakistan has simultaneously avoided hitting targets in India or proper striking. Therefore, this means that India would not be scared enough to the point where they have to lash out as a result of encirclement. Rather, it would be things like terrorism that actually trigger the crisis. Going on to SDRs. First off, they have no solvency. They don't go into effect until July 2021, which is far too late to actually answer back for COVID. Second, turn it because it fuels corruption. Hill 21 explains that there are no strings attached to how government uses SDRs. Donor countries may want recipient states to focus on requiring vaccines and accountable spending and the like, but they would surrender accountability inviting waste and corruption. There's no incentive or capability to properly allocate those resources. Third, turn it because SDRs actually make debt restructuring less likely. Hill 21 explains that SDRs would eventually go off to pay off debts to private creditors and would make restructuring or forgiveness of the loans less likely, giving creditors the green light to proceed. This reproduces debt trapping and dependency in the long run, which deepens their crisis. Fourth, there's no link. SDRs aren't actually enough. Writer 21 explains that they're allocated according to a country's IMF quota. The vast majority goes to wealthy nations. Africa would just be allocated 7% of the total for the entire continent, around half of what African governments spent in 2020. Countries would actually lose money, as the IMF explains that a member must pay up to 25% of its subscription in SDRs. Fifth, turn it because SDRs are inflationary. Chidu 16 explains that inflation in countries receiving SDR allocations was higher because of effects that encourage countries to pursue expansionary policy due to perceived safety net of higher reserves. Clemens 20 explains that higher inflation hurts the poor because their wages and welfare benefits grow less than the inflation, and this preempts their case because even if there's stimulus, the poor can't spend to get out of recession, and there's never any recovery. Six, this is non-unique. Alternative fund would have provided a notional unit of exchange which provides equal liquidity. On borrowing, on the uniqueness, first, turn it because the root cause of the debt crisis in developing nations is the reckless lending that the IMF pushed on them in the commodity boom of the 90s. Therefore, they are at best solving for a problem they created. Second, there's many better alternatives that the IMF has squashed. Kaporo 6 explains the strong development of regional monetary agreements means the EU will effectively provide assurance for members, and Asian countries will establish swap facilities to pool resources against speculative attack. But third, these private Western debtors can just forgive or restructure. They have the incentive to do this without the IMF, meaning that default will never happen. On the link level, fourth, turn it because bailouts actually cause more borrowing. Fink 16 explains that for a given level of debt, the government borrows at lower interest rates. They accumulate larger levels of external debt and lead to higher default probabilities. Prefer our evidence because theirs is from the IMF, who is biased. Fifth, turn it because they worsen the banking crisis. Stiglitz 17 explains the IMF insisted that these banks shut down as a result of not meeting the capital adequacy ratio, which caused 50% of the banks during the AFC to be null during the crisis. On the impact level, they create more austerity, which just worsens the response in the long run.
Okay, can I see the second response on our contention 3? I believe it's the Kapoor evidence.
Yep.
And then can I see the second and third response on our contention 2, the corruption and then debt traps?
For sure.
Okay,
Second
cool.
and fourth, you said?
Second and third, so corruption and debt traps.
Sounds good.
And we'll run prep as soon as we go.
Okay. I just sent it all.
Thank you.
Yep.
Let you know when we have it. Okay, I just got it.
I got it too.
Let me just open my timer. Okay. We'll run prep.
Yep.
Okay. That was 123.
Done.
All right. I'm gonna run a second more prep set. Okay. 18 seconds. Additionally, and then we used 23 before, so
123. So
so
one.
that's 141 used.
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone ready? Great. I'm going to respond to first the rebuttal we just heard and then to their case. Great. Let's go to the rebuttal. On our first contention, they read 2 turns. Both of them are CPAC is good. We'll concede that CPAC happens either way. Then on our second contention, they read 3 turns. First, they say corruption. Second, they say more debt traps. Third, they say inflation. We'll concede their last response if there's an equal amount of liquidity anyway, because other countries do things like currency swaps. Let's go to the most important argument of the round, which is our third contention. Can I have your phone, Esther? Okay. About the global financial safety net. Our argument is simple. Countries are going to default. It's not a question of whether they default, it's who they're defaulting to. If they're defaulting to Western creditors, the Dow evidence indicates that this will cause massive financial ripples across the entire financial system. But if they default to the IMF, it is a lot safer. The risk is contained within the IMF. They give 5 responses. First, they say the root cause of these crises is the IMF. No, for instance, the COVID crisis right now, the Stiglitz evidence indicates it's happening. That has not led to a default, was caused by a pandemic. For instance, Africa was caused by an oil shock. East Asia was caused by devaluing Thailand's currency. There are lots of other reasons. Second, they say the alternatives. 2 responses. A, countries go to those alternatives first. For instance, they go to the Arab Monetary Fund first, or they do currency swap lines first. However, the Dow indicates that the IMF is the international lender of last resort, which means countries have already exhausted their other options. B, as those are just currency swaps and small like projects. We're saying that the IMF is the only organization with enough capital, resources, and long-term history in order to withstand these sorts of defaults. Third, they say that they can just infinitely restructure their debt. No card here. Don't let them read a new card in the next speech. We say they can't restructure their debt infinitely, which is why McDowell indicates absent this is because of financial crisis. Then the fourth response is they will borrow or default more. It doesn't matter whether they default, it's about who they're defaulting to. That's why, for instance, even in the East Asia crisis, the reason why it didn't spread to the rest of the world was because of the IMF. Finally, they say Stiglitz says that it leads to bank closures. No, the New York Times Post states that it indicates that the IMF has actually said that they regret their behavior with bank closures in places like, for instance, Indonesia and South Korea, and are no longer doing it, which is why they don't have a single other example. Let's go to their case. Their first contention is about hegemony. We say that the dollar hegemony is good for 3 reasons. One, Zafar 18 indicates a dollar hegemony ensures that the U.S. is able to sanction any country, like, for instance, North Korea or Iran, which he indicates means that they don't have to do violent interventions. Kavanaugh 14 indicates that U.S. interventions increase the chance of violence by 20 to 25 times, which outweighs a link into conflict because those conflicts are actively going on right now. For instance, places like intervening in Afghanistan versus their war scenario has never occurred across 70 years of U.S. dollar hedge. Second of all, you turn again. Sharma 19 indicates that if the dollar ever were to be devalued, other nations would also devalue their currency in order to compete with their exports. In fact, Lazonde 13 indicates this would lead to massive capital exodus and even financial crises, and additionally hurt the poor by linking into all of their inflation weighing they read on our C1. Then, actually, I lied. There are not three reasons there too. Second of all, we say U.S. hegemony is good for two reasons. One is Wolford 11 indicates that the alternative in a bipolar and multipolar world is actors like, for instance, China and Russia would be constantly vying with one another for power. He indicates this would lead to great power war. Two implications to this. A, he indicates that it deters other actors. So even if they become more aggressive or the United States is more aggressive, they never cross the threshold, which is why the U.S. and Russia have never gone to physical combat in the past few years. But B, independent of that, the Stein indicates in 2014 that this a global nuclear war would link into all their impacts by extinction. Second of all, actually, yeah, Gutinsky 18, or no, actually I'm going to their C2. Or quickly on their impact scenario, it's been 70 years. The Skolowski evidence doesn't say that it's going to escalate to nuclear war. It just says that miscalculation is likely, just could be a conventional conflict. No reason it goes nuclear. They would never do it because of mutually assured destruction. They have extremely large hotlines. Go to their C2. 6 responses. 1, Gelb 10 indicates they can use capital from resources to diversify in the long term. The 2, Sun 18 indicates that capital from natural resources can actually increase revenues, which A, increases social spending. Comrade indicates a 1 percentage point increase in social spending decreases poverty by 0.3 percentage points, and B, encourages growth. Third is Fan 14 indicates that importing more goods can lead to exporting higher quality finished goods, which Ba 16 indicates is how countries like China were able to achieve long-term growth and compete on the international market. Fourth is there's a technology argument. Beckes 19 indicates that trade liberalization leads to countries adopting more technology they never would have otherwise have, A, making them more productive, and B, Bullard indicates they can move to a service economy in the long term. Fifth, and finally, the OECD indicates that foreign firms have higher paying jobs, which increase wages by 4%.
Can you send the fifth and fourth response on the C2?
Yeah, what were they? My number got a little messed
It
up.
was the better tack.
And
Yeah,
then
then-
high paying jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got you.
And then can I also get can I get devalue dollar and hedge good primacy?
Yeah, wait. First, I'm doing the tech turn. Then I'm doing, what am I doing now?
I don't.
OECD, the wages
OECD,
thing,
and
increases
sorry.
wages by 4%.
What did you ask for?
It was devalue dollar means crisis, hedge good because primacy deterrence, just like the normal hedge good.
And then I can so much. And then hedge good. Oh, well, okay. Just sent. Let me know when y'all get it. When y'all get it, do you want to do cross immediately or do you want to run prep to read first?
Cross will be fine.
Sounds good. Okay. Rebecca just got it. Do y'all have it?
Yeah, I think I just got it too.
Actually, yeah, I just got it. All right, y'all can do cross.
Right, cool.
Okay.
All right, so when countries, for example, restructure, renegotiate their debt, they do this with these Western creditors, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what incentive do Western creditors have to let these countries default on their debt?
No, it's not a question of incentive. It's a question of
No, nothing.
a question of capacity. So we agree that you can restructure your debt, but the McDowell evidence indicates that the countries who are going to the IMF have already restructured their debt, most likely several times. They've done it again and again and again. But
Well, why can't the Western creditors just let them do it again?
Because there's only so much risk that Western institutions, because they're privatized, right? And it's not just Western institutions, to be fair. That is what I say in rebuttal, but it's also just any private financial institution. It can only take on a certain level of risk because one, it's accountable to shareholders, right? And two, because it literally at some point begins to doubt that the country can ever make back any of the money. So for example, if we talk about like Greece restructured its debt like so many times. The same thing happened with Pakistan. There are all these countries who just constantly restructure their debt, constantly renegotiate loans and take on new creditors. But McDowell indicates that because the IMF is the international lender of last resort, they've tried that stuff already.
But at what point does the Western creditor, who, like you said, has a profit incentive, just say, okay, I no longer want to restructure my debt and even preserve the potential of some sort of payoff and just let the countries completely default?
No, it's not about
Because
letting-
if they default, then these Western creditors or just creditors in general get no payment at all. So what incentive do they have to take that as the last resort?
No, just like in 08.
What about it?
Like they literally can't. They don't have the money to. That's why
Oh, yeah,
banks
the-
failed in 08.
What do you like? Foreign creditors can always forgive debt or be like, you can pay it back at a later date. Like this has nothing to do with Western creditors' capacity.
In a default, you can't pay no money back, to be clear. You pay a portion of the loan back 100%.
No, that's called debt forgiveness. That's not
No,
what happens in a
that's not-
default.
this is- I'm sorry, actually, this is just not how it works. In a
Well,
default, you pay $0 back. Like you pay a portion of the loan back and the rest that you default on. And that's the only way that creditors sometimes can guarantee that they're going to get any money back.
why
at all.
can't they just do debt forgiveness then?
I just explained why they can't infinitely do debt forgiveness. Also,
But debt forgiveness is equivalent to default according to your definition of default. You say that default means they only pay back a portion of it. Debt forgiveness is literally the exact same thing, except these countries don't declare default.
no, that's not at all the same thing. For instance, debt forgiveness is different in that, and oftentimes, by the way, these creditors do forgive these countries' debts. Like, for instance, with Pakistan, several Western creditors and Asian banks forgave some of their debts. But the idea is it becomes untenable to the extent where continual renegotiation, continual forgiveness, and regional organizations can no longer prop them up, right? And that's
What
why
evidence is this again?
this is the McDowell evidence, which says that if one of these, functionally, that the IMF functions as the international lender of last resort and is the only thing that is holding up the Western financial system. Also, if we're talking at the idea of debt forgiveness or renegotiation, what makes these creditors more willing to forgive debt or to renegotiate is when they know they have the safety net of the IMF, so they know they'll be at least partially paid back.
Can you send the McDowell evidence?
I think I sent it in the original email. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, it's like it threatens the facility.
Where does it say they don't have the capacity to keep restructuring?
It's
Is it
two
just the
things.
highlighted part?
Well, it's the international lender of last resort bit, and then it's also the part where they go concerns about the capital adequacy of banks. That
And then yeah.
may generate it may threaten the stability of the entire domestic financial system.
Okay, cool. We're
Which
gonna call
sorry, which card was wages again?
OECD. I believe it should be like fourth or something in the doc.
Is it OECD 11?
OECD 11, yeah.
Or does it say wages higher rather?
Oh wait, totally.
That might be the wrong.
Yeah,
that might
yeah.
have been the
Sorry,
wrong
just
one.
command F OECD. One sec. Here we go. I got it. Foreign firms pay higher wages. My bad.
No worries.
Just
Did
sent
you
it.
say- Okay. Yeah. We'll take prep as soon as I get it.
What is it?
Are we waiting for the card?
Yes, we're gonna wait for the card.
Okay. Okay, I think I just got it. You good, Josh?
Hold on 1 second. Yeah, I'm good.
We'll start prep and then once you're connected. Starting now. All right, that was a minute 02.
Okay.
How much have y'all used total before you give them?
I think we used like a minute 20 before rebuttal. Does that sound right, Josh?
I think so.
Okay, so 40 seconds left.
Okay, it's gonna start on the neg C2 for aligning on the F. Everybody good? Okay. Group all of the terms they concede our second link, which is that foreign investment means all the money flows right out of the country, which means A, there's not going to be enough money for social spending because it's not going to government, it's going to foreign creditors. B, there's not money for long-term sustainability. C, there's no money to buy tech. And D, there's no money going to higher wage jobs. Go to our first contention on hegemony. Our argument is that they've conceded our link that by pegging all other currencies to the dollar, the IMF established US dollar hegemony, but yes, they conceded that they were terms. Go to the terms. One, they say sanctions are an alternative to military intervention. No, they are not, because in a world in which we were never a hegemon, the alternative didn't exist. We weren't intervening in every place. We didn't have a military supported by our infinite spending to be a hegemon, which means the alternative is just a false dichotomy. Second of all, extinction outweighs this argument significantly on magnitude. Then they say that a devaluation of the dollar will cause a crisis. Sure, if we devalued the dollar now, but the resolution is not let's end the IMF, it's bends to harms of the IMF. So if the dollar was never hegemonic, the devaluation of the dollar, and if currencies were not all pegged to the dollar, then obviously it would not cause a crisis. That's their argument. On hedge good. One, the argument this article makes is that decline from primacy to multilateralism is bad. It is hedge decline bad. But if we were never a hegemon in the first place, there's no reason why hedge decline causes fill-in because none of these countries were deterring the U.S. in the first place. Second of all, Russia and China are defensive. They are not inherently going to just expand if the U.S. wasn't there. The reason why Russia expanded is because they were in competition with us after we took over every Western financial institution. And the reason why China expanded is because literally the ascension to China hegemony is because we were pressuring them. If the U.S. never existed, these countries would A, are not rivals, so they would not have gone to war. B, would not be even in great power competition because again, it's if the U.S. was never a hegemon in the first place. On the internal link. They say that there's no reason why it goes nuclear. They concede the star evidence that says the U.S. thinks we have nuclear primacy, which means we think we can take out Russia in one first strike, which is what invites the miscalculation. Extend the internal link that dollar hedge is critical to military hegemony because it allows us to infinitely spend, and extend the argument that the Sokolsky evidence as of 2 weeks ago says we're barreling towards conflict, which Starr says goes to extinction because of our primacy and nuclear war goes to extinction. Let's weigh. First is on magnitude and time frame, it's extinction and it's permanent. Second's on a prereq, we can't do bailouts and there's going to be more economic crises, and on severity because it's death. Go to their case. First of all, extend the alternatives argument. They just say that the alternatives are big enough. Sure, but if the IMF wasn't squashing alternatives left and right because they wanted to maintain U.S. Western financial hegemony, maybe the alternatives would be able to solve the problem they create. Second of all, they have conceded the argument literally in cross. JJ said that private debtors were restructuring, which means they probably would anyway. On the austerity turn, they concede the IMF does austerity, which stops long-term growth, which is why they're in a bad position economically because they can't pay off debts because there was no growth. And austerity meant they couldn't handle COVID as well, which is why we're in the crisis that they say to prereqs to their case.
Okay, you need evidence.
Yeah, can I say absent the US, China and Russia would just be chilling?
What?
Like China and Russia wouldn't care about being aggressive at all absent the US.
I don't.
And also the star evidence that says that we think we could win a war.
I can send star. I don't have a card for that.
Okay, cool. Then it's just star.
Okay, we're That's right.
We used 141. So we have 119.
Sounds good.
Okay. I just sent star.
I'll tell you when I get it. Just got it. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Okay, starting prep now. Okay,
How much prep do y'all have left?
that was prep.
I almost just did that in unison with you, which would have been embarrassing.
What going through the first time. All right, it's gonna start on, sorry. Okay. It's gonna start on the F case. The cleanest place to vote in this round is on our contention theory about the global financial safety net. The Stiglitz evidence explains that just like in the 80s, 90s, during the third world debt crisis, the world is now on a verge of a debt crisis. $130 billion in debt is owed right now. The vocal evidence explains that a lot of this debt is owed to the financial system all around the world, private banks. However, McDowell finds that if the IMF wasn't there, all of these countries would be forced to default on their debt, spinning the world into a large-scale financial crisis. However, the IMF has been there, like it has been over and over again, to save these countries from defaulting and save these banks from going under. However, if they weren't there, the BU evidence finds that 100 million people would go into poverty. They blithely answer this argument twice in summary. First, they just say, oh, they're alternatives. First, this is through Inc. They don't respond to JJ's frontline, which explains that they've gone to their alternatives first. They say, oh, they would have been better without the IMF. No, they have already gone to every single alternative. A lot of alternatives were actually created because of the IMF, and they still can't be better. But second, all of their alternatives that they read are literally just currency swaps. They would have to prove that there would be some better alternative that fills in. Don't let them give this new analysis in First Final Focus. It's too late. Then they just say that, oh, banks can just like forgive or restructure. Also through Inc., the McDowell evidence explains that they literally can't because they don't have the capacity to, which is why I'd go to an all-out debt crisis. We outweigh their argument. Oh yeah, then they just say that like austerity is bad. JJ Frontline says what he says, it doesn't matter who you default to. So, I mean, it doesn't matter how much debt you have or how bad your economy is, so long as you're not defaulting as long as you're not defaulting to Western banks and instead you're defaulting to the IMF, because that averts a financial crisis. We outweigh their argument for three reasons. Or four reasons actually. First, it's a prereq because it makes if the Western financial crisis happens, it makes hedge inevitable. Second, though, someone is inevitably going to fill in if the Western financial system collapses. So even if it's not the US, it'll just be a worse actor because someone needs to give these bailouts. Third, in terms of probability, they don't answer JJ's response, which is that there are all sorts of things like mutually assured destruction. The US is never going to want to go to an all-out nuclear war, even if they think they could win it. That's preposterous, which is why it's been 70 years and we've never seen even a risk of a nuclear war before Russia and China, but we've seen over and over in the 80s, 90s, and the third world debt crisis that the IMF has always been there to step in. But fourth, because financial crises cause war, destroying trade ties between countries erodes deterrence and increases the risk of all wars, not just one versus US and Russia, because we no longer have the same mutually assured destruction, which is why we outweigh on scope. They just say, oh, they prerequisites nuke war. First, we link in. Second, if the impact's not probable, it's stupid to just vote off of it, because then we would always be making policy decisions that are really, really bad just to like avoid some 1% chance of nuclear war. It's literally never happened before. Then on their case, though, you can extend the Zofar evidence, which explains that because because we have the dollar hedge, we can do sanctions instead of large-scale conflicts. Absent that, there'd be a 25% increase in the chance of conflict. They just say there's not the alt because the US would not be the hedge, but no, we say the alt would be them doing military strength military strength.
We're gonna call before Grand real quick.
Oh,
Sorry.
Oh,
Oh,
they're
Brad.
on a call.
Starting.
That was another
All right.
17. Okay. Are you ready for Grant? I suppose I should ask.
Oh, wait, did you say something? I really was not.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I said that was 17 seconds more, and then are you ready for Grant?
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
and
yes.
yes.
And yes.
No worries.
Let's all spend together. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, can I have the first question?
Yeah, go
of
for it.
course.
Skylar, do you want one? Or can I?
Go ahead, Josh.
Okay. So, so you say that like they went to all the alternatives, but if in a world in which the IMF never existed, the alternatives are stronger, why does that mean like the alternatives could not have worked?
So one, I don't think that the Kapoor evidence is doing that work for you. And
No, it's the other piece of evidence that I read from Stiglitz that says that they crushed better alternatives which would have liquidity during times of crises.
Stiglitz evidence? You mean your fifth response that was about the banks in East Asia?
No, it was the implication from Kapoor.
Okay, sure. But second of all,
Yeah.
yeah, sure. But second of all, our argument is that even if it's true that those banks have the capacity to do things like, for example, the Arab Monetary Fund or even the Fed doing like currency swaps, that's fully proven, right? We have no proof that due to the fact that those are not like international organizations, and more importantly, those are all organizations run primarily by poorer countries, like for instance, the Arab Monetary
Well,
Fund.
I understand that, but I'm
To
saying
be fair, if you want to win any offense about this being like great and powerful, then there's probably going to be some sort of, because it's going to be done in one currency, no? Which is the way that I read. So if it's going to be
wait,
done,
why does it have to be done in one currency? Why can't there just be multiple regional banks bailing out their regions?
making up some,
Like, are we just saying that I think it's a lot to prove, y'all, that like in the absence of the IMF, every regional bank would grow to
Wait,
their
but,
central
like,
supply, right? And if it is
it's-
true that it's regional banks, we agree. Sure, it's regional banks. That proves our argument more because an individual regional bank cannot
Exactly.
sustain constant
But-
defaults in the same way the IMF can.
Well, wait, but why can't they? But they don't. That's the thing is they don't have to have worldwide solvency. They, for example, like the AMF would have only had to have enough liquidity to support Asia, or for example, like the African Union Development Bank would have only had
Yeah,
enough money to support that continent, right? Like,
Yeah,
why
but-
can't those things?
you've never been able to prove that one bank in Africa would be able to solve for all of Africa, or one bank in
Well,
Asia.
one bank in the world is enough to solve for this. Like, I mean, that's the equivalent, right?
No. To be fair, we both agree the IMF is significant, and this is the point that Rebecca was making about 20 seconds ago, right? Like, if the IMF is really just one bank in the world and it can't solve for financial crises, it definitely doesn't cause nuclear war with Russia.
Well, that's an entirely different argument. It was about the initial pegging the IMF
No,
did.
but you can't at the same time be like, oh, the IMF is insignificant and petty and doesn't do anything.
I can say that the IMF maybe can't lend to all 200 countries on Earth, and also say that they initially pegged currencies to the dollar, which caused hedge. Those are not mutually exclusive arguments, even a little bit.
Our argument has nothing to do with lending. Our argument is rather about sustaining the risk of defaults. Of course, the IMF can't lend to every single country in the world, and it doesn't need to. All it needs to do is prop up those countries that are most dangerous, and otherwise.
And that's because it's a
threat.
multilateral institution, which is why it has like all great powers are all involved in the IMF. It's not just like one region, which is why one small region could not control for like the whole region.
Okay, that makes sense.
And you like don't read any evidence that says it could, so it's just kind of.
Well, I mean, okay.
Okay, we're gonna call and we'll start prep once we get connected. Starting.
Hey, how much prep do y'all have?
We had 3 seconds left.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. That's fine. I'll just take it right now. Okay. So the order is going to be doing Wang at the top, and then I'll move on to our case and then their case, and I'll address their Lincolns on the Wang. They've conceded the magnitude Wang Josh told you. They've conceded that a nuclear war goes to extinction. Any risk of extinction means that you vote pro. They say prefer probability, but 1, we just outlined a specific scenario, which means that we are probable. And 2, just because it's never happened in the past before doesn't mean that you should keep rolling the dice for the future. Their probability weighing puts us in situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and eventually it causes extinction in nuclear war. Second is the Perec Wang. During a major power war between Russia and the US, there's no capacity to spend time negotiating bailouts with these nations. Their impact is non-unique with ours, and even without extinction, you are forced to evaluate our case first. They give you a new Lincoln. First off, just cross off your flow. Second summary is too late, but they also say that they link in because economic collapse means that someone is going to fill in and cause nuclear war. One, this is empirically untrue. During 08, we had the worst Western financial system collapse, and that didn't unseat dollar hedge. Therefore, it's not a link into our case. Then they say that it destroys trade ties, which increases the propensity of war. First off, we don't have trade ties with Russia in the status quo, meaning that destroying them doesn't increase the propensity of war. And second off, they haven't outlined which countries go to war. Therefore, destroying trade ties doesn't matter. Don't let them fill this in second final focus. On our case, we told you that the IMF was the institution that pegged the dollar to the gold and created dollar hedge hegemony across the world. At that point, this is the internal link to military spending because it allows us to finance our military infinitely and essentially go to war with Russia. They just say sanctions are going to be the alternative. First off, they've dropped Josh's front line that says that there's no military intervention without hegemony because the U.S. can't finance the military in the first place. And second off, extinction is always going to outweigh. They say mutually assured destruction solves our impact scenario. First off, Josh told you that miscalc is the internal link due to primacy. Mutually assured destruction only applies if we think that Russia will strike back and demolish us. But if we think that we can take out Russia with one strike, then mutually assured destruction doesn't apply. But second off, our evidence is excellent, preferred over theirs, which says that we are literally barreling towards war with Russia in the status quo. Nukes are going to be launched. It's going to go to extinction. On their case, first off, they've conceded that the reason why these countries do not have growth to pay off the debt and are in a debt crisis in the first place is because the IMF squashed their domestic social spending. That means that even if they're defaulting to the IMF, they have conceded that the IMF is just solving for a problem that they have created. And that means that their argument has no net benefit. But secondly, they've conceded our Stiglitz evidence is that their alternatives to the IMF is squashed, which would have existed in place of the IMF had they had a larger capacity. They say they've exhausted all their options, but they couldn't have gone to alternatives that didn't exist. That's terminal defense on the case.
Okay. Is everyone ready? At the end of this debate, let's be honest, we'll probably both win our impact. So let's win our contention 3. The Stiglitz evidence indicates the world's on the verge of a debt crisis. There are $130 billion owned to country or Western creditors. In fact, that's what the Vogel evidence is. McDowell indicates absent the IMF, interconnectivity means that one default could threaten the entirety of the Western financial system. Luckily, the IMF solves. The Krugman evidence indicates that just like in the 80s and 90s, if a country defaults, they default to the IMF instead of Western creditors, which averts a recession that puts 100 million people into poverty. They give us 2 responses. They're both blippi. One is the root cause. I already answered the root cause argument by saying that there are other things like, for instance, Africa had an oil shock, East Asia had the devaluation of the baht, like COVID is happening right now. Obviously answer. The second thing they tell you is the IMF is killing alternatives, but they don't respond to Rebecca's response, which is that even if these organizations are somewhat good, all their power can never match the IMF because they are not multilateral, and also the only things they're doing right now are currency swaps. There is no evidence that they would be anywhere near as strong as the IMF. Don't let them win off of this analytic. We have both won our arguments in this debate. We are going to go for 2 reasons why our argument outweighs. The first one is the most damning one, and it is incredibly undercovered. The first prerequisite that Rebecca reads is that if we win our argument, it makes hegemonic decline inevitable, because if there's a massive Western financial crisis where the financial system collapses, obviously it triggers all of their impacts. They say 2 things. One, they say second summary is too late. This is not a Norman PF. I don't know what that means. Obviously, we didn't know what they were going for until first summary. Second of all, they say this didn't happen in 08. 08 is a massive reason why China gained significant hegemony because the US financial system crashed. But even then, 08 was just 2 banks. Imagine what would happen if the entire financial system went under. That means that we can try to link to all of their impacts about extinction. We agree, extinction comes first. We're just saying we're a prerequisite. The second thing, though, is we went on the probability weighing. We say very clearly, and this analysis is dropped, that even if the US thinks they can win a war, they have every incentive not get involved. And they drop that they have hotlines and lots of incentives between the US and Russia to cooperate. They get 2 responses about why probability is bad. One, they say we shouldn't roll, or one, they say we're probable because we're specific. No, you're not. We also give specific analysis about why you're improbable. You need to answer our warrants. Second of all, they say don't roll the dice. We say that if we like that rolling, or this isn't rolling the dice, this is pushing off an improbable scenario of extinction for right now. The fact that we know with certainty that in the 80s, 90s, and third world debt crisis, along with now, it was effective. Probability and prerequisites. Good round, y'all.
Good round, guys.
Good round, y'all.
Can I see the Stiglitz evidence if it's not already in the email chain?
Yeah, I'll send it. Just give me 1 second to pull it up. Sorry, I had to restart my Word, but I'm grabbing it right now. Okay. I'm emailing right now. Sorry for the wait.
No worries. Thanks.
Can I see the can I see from Con the miscalc evidence?
Yeah, Josh, you there? Can you send that?
Yeah, I got it. Specifically, which like we're barreling towards or miscalc
Yeah,
causes
barreling towards and
Do you just want all of
evidence
the
about the US thinking miscalc leading the US into thinking it can win a nuclear war.
Yes,
That's uniqueness of
I got it. I have it. Yeah,
Okay.
I have it. It's got it.
Cool.
And the barreling towards war point.
Yes, yeah, it's there. It's I just sent it. The Sokolsky is barreling. The Zuckerman is miscalc, and the star is like we think we can win a nuke war, like the primacy stuff.
I'm sorry, you said you sent the Sokolsky evidence?
Yeah, it might have taken a second. Did everybody else get my email?
I got Sokolsky.
Yeah, I got it.
Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. I had to reload my email.
Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Sorry, is the barreling towards war a paraphrase or is that an exact quotation?
barreling towards wars that tag the quotation is what we read from it. Unintended escalation is likely, and the risk is likely to increase as opposing forces continue to operate in close proximity. And also the top highlight as well. Like from what I read.
Okay, I got it. Okay. Oh, okay. I think I was the last judge to vote. And so I think that, does that mean I announced the decision, I'm guessing? So the vote was a 2-1 decision for the con. So no, wait, sorry. No, it was a 2-1 decision for the pro. It was a 2-1 decision for the pro. I apologize. It was a 2-1 decision for the pro. I was the squirrel. I don't know if that means I go first, or do the judges who voted in the majority want to go first since I announced? So why don't you all go first?
Okay, yeah, sure. I can go first. So I think that, I mean, this was a great round. First of all, congratulations to everybody. Obviously, it's incredible achievement, yada, yada. One of the most incredible rounds I've ever judged. I totally tend to agree that both teams generally win their impacts and that the round kind of ultimately comes down to weighing. I think there's a little bit of doubt in my mind about the AF's offense, about the card with the Asian Monetary Fund. The card's good and it's very clear. But I'm not sure that it actually proves solvency for what the AF is talking about. I tend to buy the AF argument that even if the regional banks would be stronger without the IMF, that they still couldn't solve the problem that the AF is talking about. So I think that the AF still gains access to all their impacts. Obviously, there's no defense on the neg argument about the Russian miscalc by the end of the round. So then I just looked to the weighing. Okay, so obviously I agree the extinction is the ultimate impact we're looking for. Great. The question just becomes, who do I think better links into this extinction impact? I think that the AF prereq analysis is really clean. I think that it's cleanly extended from summary to final focus. I think that the neg doesn't really handle it well enough. They kind of just try to turn it into their own prereq analysis, but that doesn't actually respond to the warranting of the prereq from coming out of the AF. So I don't really end up. So I essentially give the prereq to the AF, and then yeah. So I also think that the neg extinction scenario is kind of tricky. I buy the I mean, obviously the warrants and the actual argument because there's no responses to it by the end of the round. But I think that the mutually assured destruction stuff is giving me pause. And when I look at the actual cards, the only real articulation about the way the US will think they can win a nuclear war is a star evidence, which is citing a report from 2006. And I'm not sure how confident I am that in the last 15 years, the US has confidently thought that they were going to win a nuclear war with Russia and for whatever reason has chosen not to. I think that maybe you get a little bit, can gain a little bit of that ground back with the Tucholsky evidence, but it still doesn't say that we're headed toward nuclear war, just that we're headed toward conflict of some kind. So I have trouble believing that, I don't know, I just have some doubt in my mind, essentially, that we're going to actually, that we are barreling towards nuclear war and that the US thinks they can win a nuclear war. So I think that because I think the prereq analysis is clean and because I have a little bit of doubt about the mutually assured destruction stuff, I end up defaulting to the easiest place to vote, which I think is the prereq.
Yeah, so my decision was also pretty similar. I buy the Lincoln into global war. I actually don't really evaluate whether or not miscalc goes nuclear or not because the Lincoln happens. So I think that pro gets access to those impacts. The reason why I think pro gets access to the Lincolns is because one, I think JJ is right that the alt causes for the current debt crises are on the flow. They read that they're alt crises. It's not just the fact that there was it's not just the IMF that was causing the current economic situation in these countries, which means that it's not dependent on whether or not there was an IMF in the first place. So that means I buy that the IMF existing right now probably means that they're going to solve for any impending defaults that happen with all the countries they talk about. So there's two things here. One, there's probably an independent impact off of that, which is the 100 million people go into poverty. It wasn't really fleshed out in final focus on pro, but it's there. It doesn't really matter anyways because the war impact is more terminal. So that's where I buy that AF solves for the debt crisis. On the Stiglitz evidence about how there wouldn't be any alternative monetary funds without the IMF, sure, that makes sense, but at the same time, their argument is more that the IMF is a last resort, and these countries have exhausted the alt causes already, which means that you would need to give me analysis that if the alt causes didn't exist in the first place, the IMF still would not be able to bail out these countries. So either way, I buy that the IMF is a last resort. So whether or not there were alternatives in the first place, I still buy that whatever debt crises exist right now due to alt causes like oil or COVID, the IMF bails them out. And at that point, I buy that that probably prevents global recession or global econ collapse, and that links into nuclear. Yeah, and at the point at which they have a link into nuke war, like the weighing on probability doesn't really matter.
Yeah, so for me, both final focuses were really scattered and blippy. Like I kind of felt like both teams were just kind of saying things and they really weren't contextualizing them. And I thought that was a shame for the pro because I thought the pro summary was really good. And I thought the pro summary did a great job of putting the pro in position to win the round. And then the pro final focused, I really wasn't sure like what you were going for, what your narrative was, what your theme was. I just felt like you were just putting ink on the flow and trying to cover as much as possible. So I guess for me, there were a couple of issues, right? First of all, like in terms of probability, like if you're going to weigh on probability, I think you need to do more work on their evidence as to why like miscalc is not likely to happen. And I don't think you do a lot of work on their analysis. Like you tell me like mutually assured destruction, but then you don't really engage with their argumentation about neocons. And I agree with my fellow judge, like that evidence is a bit problematic. I don't think in 2020 Washington, D.C., neocons are running too much foreign policy in 2020. However, I am a minimally interventionist judge. Those arguments were not made by the con. Like the con doesn't do any of the analysis on their evidence. They don't do any of the argumentation about the current political climate. So if you're not going to make those arguments, I'm not going to make those arguments for you. So yeah, I did not go as far as my fellow judge and sort of weighing the evidence because you all didn't do the work. And I try and do as little work as possible. That's a rule that has gotten me through life and gotten me through life really well, doing as little as possible. That was a joke, y'all laugh. So, like, I think if you're going to outlay on probability, you need to do more work on their argumentation, their warrants. You need to show why, like, this scenario isn't likely to happen. I don't think you all did that well enough to satisfy me. So I get the whole you all trying to link into war, but that's not really, I think, a theme that you fleshed out in your final focus. Like the arguments were on the flow, but I'm never really sure by the end of the debate, like why debt crisis leads to like war. Like why, like if all these banks default, are we going to go to war? Like, can someone tell me why now? Seriously, like tell me now why.
Oh, because we say the collapse of the Western financial system per the McDowell evidence, DEX US like economic hedge, which links into their internal like about like US econ hedge being key to
Wait, say that again. So the McDowell evidence says what?
McDowell evidence says that absent the IMF, we would see the collapse of the Western financial system, and we say that that's a prerequisite because if you deck the Western financial system, they lose the primary sort of pillar of that economic hegemony, which is the internal link to their case. But yeah,
I thought they were saying that U.S. hegemony is bad.
yeah, we're saying it's a prerequisite. So like if we win our impact, we also cause their impact, but we co-opt their offense.
Wait, I'm confused. And this is the problem with your like final focus, right? Their argument is that U.S. hegemony relies on U.S. economic power, right? Your argument is debt crisis, no more U.S. economic power. So doesn't that mean no more U.S. hegemony, ergo no more war?
I don't know. We're probably wrong about it. I'm not sure. I don't want to post.
Yeah, and that's the problem. Like if you don't flesh that out, like you leave, and I'm not a very smart guy. That means I have to work all this out in my head, right? And you don't want to leave it for me to work out in my head, right? You all want to make it so crystal clear that a guy like me, who knows absolutely nothing, right, can figure out why you win the round. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. And there's another argument in this round that again and again Khan extends. Now, Khan, you don't do a very good job of contextualizing this argument, but again and again they extend it, right? And they make this argument that IMF policies drain capital out of countries and drain money out of social welfare and stop social development. They say it in almost every speech. They don't tell me why it matters, but they repeat it. And it goes clean untouched, right? And for me, that's like, okay, so there's this nuclear war argument that I kind of buy. And then there's this other story that they keep repeating that the other side doesn't even touch. That gives me a reason to vote for the pro. So that's how I saw the round, or the con. I don't know which side I voted for at this point. That's how I saw the round. Take my advice with a grain of salt. Congratulations to both teams. You're obviously fantastic.
Thanks for the
Okay,
feedback.
thanks
Good
so much
run,
for the
guys.
feedback.
Really
Nice round.
Y'all.
Thank you for debating us.